fill the gap when it comes to the manpower. Organised crime, what a subject, hey? Fantastic. Just to give you a bit of background of who I am when it comes to talking about organised crime, because you're probably saying, you know, what do you know about organised crime? Well, actually, I know it's probably a little bit more than most people. I'm ex-military for a start, and I worked in military intelligence and things like that for 24 years. Once I left that, I actually joined the police service. And because someone saw me using a calculator, they said, you know, you're the right person to join the fraud squad. So I ended up being seconded to the fraud squad for 6 months. And that 6 months lasted 16 years. So you can imagine the amount of sort of financial fraud, corruption, embezzlement, the politicians, that sort of period of time, you know, and the experience I obtained from it. So when I left the fraud squad, I decided what I'd do is to actually turn that on its head. And because I had academic sort of inroads to universities teaching the subject whilst I was in the police service, I turned that into a business, and then I sort of hooked up with my professional colleagues. But what I'm going to be talking about today is a subject which is how can we fill the gap when it comes to the manpower that is clearly not present to investigate organised crime, especially financial crime, because that's my background, financial crime. So I've been fortunate enough to be accepted in the Paris Graduate School to write a thesis, a PhD thesis on this subject. And I feel quite honoured to be able to do that. So, because the problem we have in the UK is that there doesn't seem to be any sort of energy, positive energy coming from the government to actually try and even curb the effects of what organised crime is actually creating. Because organised crime is not a question, it's not a subject that just sits on the shelf and people say, oh, it's a bad thing. It filters down through the layers of communities and destroys the very fabric of where we live, society, and businesses. So everyone at some level or another will be affected by some organised crime. I've said this before, that we had a Home Secretary some time ago. His name was Jack Straw, and some of you may have heard me say this before, but he was the only person who took it seriously. And he said fraud and corruption and economic crime is like a deadly virus. Left unchecked, creates huge inequalities and undermines the very foundations of democratic government. Now, if you take that in its context, it's absolutely true. So what is the UK government trying to do about it? It's not, as Jerry said, it's not just us in the United Kingdom. It's a global issue. It's a global issue because fraud, corruption, embezzlement does not have boundaries. Because we are a global village anyway, because we deal business on a global scale, it migrates both outwards and then comes back as well. So it's a question of why does not the UK government be more serious about it? Well, the area which I'm looking at is that we have a fast developing profession, and it's a global profession called private investigators. Now, let me just sit that there for a second. So what am I saying about private investigators? Over the years, they have developed their skill base to an enormous proficiency level, because For a start, corporations most likely would go to them because they know they'll get instant service and good results. Because if they report, if a case is reported through the legal system, through the police, etc., yes, there might be some action, but when? And how effective will it be? But if you put it through the private investigator side, you'll find that the success rate is far greater. And of course, the time frame is reduced. So that's my point I'm making. There's been very little research done on this, because the way I'm looking at it is that should not the government start to look at perhaps interagency cooperation, but to include private investigators? Now, how can they be policed? The government once said that we must find a way of policing the private investigators because it's becoming the fastest growing profession across the planet. There is an enormous amount of skills contained within the private investigator profession. A high percentage of them come from government departments. They have retired, but retain the skill, and therefore they are automatically attuned to perhaps the court system, legislation required, the boundaries that they can work within, etc. So why don't we use that? So that's my area of study. I did write some papers, and I sort of just sort of went off piece. But really, in all honesty, you know, we're saying now of the 43 police forces in the UK, very few now have the capability to investigate fraudulent crime activity, and that's a fact. Because when I was in the fraud squad, it was the third largest fraud squad in the country, and almost overnight, it was cut by 50%. Now, how can that be when the crime rate of financial crime is going through the roof? Where's the justification? Where's the rationale behind it? It was all a cost-saving exercise that the chief constable at the time was required to make. And he sliced 50% of the fraud squad. A crazy business decision, but that's what happened. So we're saying the Action Fraud website of 2009, which is the City of London Police, for example, was set up as a one-stop shop for cases of fraud and financial crime for both the private consumer and businesses. It allows for the self-reporting of cases which are then referred to the relevant police force for a line of inquiry. Okay, fine. This often takes days or weeks if it is referred to at all. So this is a clear example of lack of resource to respond to cases of crime in a timely and professional manner that would, under normal circumstances, be expected by those reporting. So, ladies and gentlemen, we know that there, you know, the police service, the official government departments who have a responsibility to look after the interests of the general public, etc., and businesses, their reputation is at an all-time low. So we have to do something. You know, if the government does not wake up very quickly, all I'm saying is that the financial loss will be so great in this country that individual people are going to start to suffer more than they're suffering at this moment in time. I'm sure there's a few issues that you'd like to sort of bring out. So please, just if you have a question about it, I'd love you to sort of put a challenging question up so we can debate something on it. You know, if there's an example of interagency cooperation that you are aware of, please bring it on board. The United States of America, prior to 9/11, the police services or the security services did not want anything to do with any private industry when it comes to the security of the country. 9/11 came. From 9/11, a new policy comes to the surface. There was a 500% increase in interagency cooperation between the police services, security services, and private industry. Now, they have set a precedence. They have set a, they now write papers on experiences, what they learned, what went wrong, how they can achieve results for the good and benefit. You know, because it all came into a little sphere called home security. And home security was the driving force that pushed that initiative forward. Now, if the US can do that almost overnight, why can't we follow suit? And I think it's a fair question and a fair challenge to the UK government that we should be able to say that. You're responsible, do something about it. You're saying that you don't have any money, but you said that in the start of austerity in 2010. We're now in the second period of austerity, 2021. When's it going to end? There has to be a wake-up call, and someone, government, and I must admit, you know, you can see what the UK government is at the moment. It's just in ruins. We're not quite sure what's going to happen in the next general election, but my personal opinion is, can it get any worse? But there has to be something put in place. Financial crime is going through the roof. And you know, there's very little response to try and level out the level playing field. There's towns and cities in the UK where people are afraid to go out and walk after 5 o'clock in the evening, especially in this weather, because of the darkness. How can that be? That was never the case when I was growing up. But going beyond that, you know, there are rules and regulations and you know, dare I say it, the Financial Action Task Force that's in place, and their recommendations that we're saying, oh yes, we do it, and we tick in the box. But we might tick in the box, but they're ineffective. We're not doing anything about it. We expect that something's going to happen, but we can't put too much finance to it or effort because we just don't have it. So that's my problem. It's a global problem, because, as I said, crime, financial crime, whether it be, you know, fraud, corruption, embezzlement, you know, money laundering, you name it, you know, slavery, drugs, it doesn't respect borders. So it's a global problem. It's a global problem. Now, the UK government said that they looked at the involvement of private investigators. But last year, they said, yeah, no problem at all. What we'll do is we'll have them licensed. Now, suddenly this year, they've done a 360 and said, well, actually, they don't have to be licensed anymore. And what does that mean? It means that anybody with no ethical sort of backing at all or professional standing can call themselves a private investigator and start to fleece perhaps corporations and individuals because they said, I'm a private investigator. Unless the government recognised the private investigator industry as a proper bona fide agency, nothing is going to move forward. And that is really the centre of my paper. And I'm sort of hoping that by the end of it, perhaps in 18 months' time, when I get to bring it all together, there might be some sort of pathway created and perhaps some idea as how we can push this initiative forward. But it's going to take a huge change of policy, and government are very slow in changing policy. And the trouble with policy is that policy is okay if it's a standalone policy and is simple to implement. And that's where your problem comes when there's a change of government, a change of personality, and there's a shift in personalities within governments. That's going to be the biggest enemy as well. But the fact remains is that the police service are understaffed. They're certainly underskilled. The private industry, i.e. private investigators, have now come to a level of proficiency that makes them very, very attractive to corporations who say, we will go to you because we know we'll get fast results. One corporation that I spoke to said they were scared and frightened at the level of efficiency and swiftness of information that was returned to them by a private investigator. It was mind-boggling. They said it was excellent. Now, we know that the history of the private investigator is someone with a trench coat and a hat, and probably on the big screen. But that's moved forward. That is a light year away from what it is now. They are a professional body. They run by professional standards. They have good ethics. And you might still argue that they work to a certain line, you know, perhaps the line where they don't cross. There's a few things they can't do, of course, is to put trackers on cars or go onto, or, you know, follow people onto private property. Those things they can't do anyway, but that's all covered by other legislation. But I think it's worth a research paper. I really, really do. Because if it's happened in America, why can't it happen here? And there's good information, good evidence to support that it works. Of course, you're going to have a few initial problems to iron out. But all that's been covered by post-event reports and analysis in America. Could I sort of just throw out some interest? Is there anything that people might have an idea about?
David, may I ask?
Yeah.
The UK exiting the EU, does that have any impact on law enforcement interacting with their partners in Europe and further afield? Yeah,
it has, because it's disrupted the legal synergy that was in place as an agreement between different countries and different, different jurisdictions. Because years ago, we used to be able to be part of what are called Eurojust, and our representative was in this office and someone else from another country was in another office over there. And if we wanted a letter of request or a letter rogatory, so to speak, speak to a witness in that particular country. We just produce a piece of paper, a request, and walk down the corridor and say to whoever it might be, you know, can we arrange this? And that could be completed in a matter of sort of an hour. But now you're looking at a process that you have to produce the paperwork. You have to go through the proper channels. There has to be a proper letter, rogatory, etc., to make that request. And it could take months. And of course, all that does, it makes an inquiry long and protracted. And by extended that period of time, it means by the time it gets into a court, if it gets into a court, the quality and information of evidence may well be so outdated that the court might turn around and say, it's silly. So thanks, Jerry. There's been a huge disruption now of the relationship between different countries and jurisdictions. It's not a question now of me phoning up a friend of mine somewhere else, give my unique reference number, which we had, and of course then work through it that way. All that is gone. All that is gone. And as I said, it's just made it so long now, the process. So that's my area of research. And I hope to complete it within the next 18 months. So, you know, watch this space. Yes.
Yeah, it is Dr. So this is wonderful research you have taken on. And with the globalization and the UK government and the corporations, insurance companies, every organization is getting digital now.
Yeah.
The less main access, even their call centers and are finishing, and it's all digital now. So the crime has no boundaries. So with this, in this way, if a criminal is not based in UK, and of course, if they are committing some crime, because nowadays the telephones are having the UK number, but they are based somewhere here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they bounce from. They bounce from.
We know the efficiency of the police. The police efficiency has always been doubtful throughout centuries. This is what people has less trust toward the police. And you are talking about the private investigator. What should be the strategy to deal with all these things in a way when the fraudulents are not available in this UK? They are somewhere else, they are operating with the digital things. So how the investigation can take place for them? And of course, the private investigators will cost something to the organization.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a number of levels of the number of gates that will have to be sort of examined. For a start, technology is now sort of far outpacing capability to control it. You know, we talk about AI and, you know, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and blockchain and so on and so forth and so on. There is so much out there now that people are saying, how can we control it? Well, I would tend to suggest that let's turn it on its head and say to ourselves, how can we understand it? And B, how can we work with it? And I think that might be an approach as to, if we learn how to work with it, we then can sort of break it down and look at its DNA or how it works. And perhaps somewhere in that process, we can then incorporate traps, isolation, and so on and so forth. But one of the things you said that with regard to it being global, I would love to have the one answer to actually give you, but I think it's going to be an answer that is a long way off, because the effects of globalization, the speed of technology development is going to have an impact on global economies for years to come. All we can try and do is to hope that countries have the appetite to try and incorporate some controls within their particular jurisdiction. And hopefully that way they will put some firewalls in when it comes to the relationship of businesses, corporations, and perhaps satellites around the globe. It's a very difficult question to answer because I don't know the answer. And if someone can tell me the answer, I'll be very, very happy to hear them. You know, of course, there's suggestions that any controls when it comes to that is down to the creator of that particular piece of software. I agree. They have a responsibility, a duty of care. But of course, that's weighed off against profit margins. So another variable comes into it. And yes, it's going to be a great problem. It's going to be a huge problem. But the idea of how those controls and the relationship has given me an idea that I can try and incorporate something along those lines in my paper, if I may have your permission to do so.
Yes.
And I think it's an area that, whilst is slightly separate, does run parallel, and it might be critical to where the paper might end up in the future. So, I mean, private investigators, those I have spoken to, have a global network. That is the beauty of private investigators. They're not local. Whilst he might be operating from the high street, his outreach is global. And that's a good thing, because they have come together almost like a global agency. There's a code of practice amongst all of them, which just might be some platform for improvement.
Served as home secretary, registry.
You have.
This time is you're right, it is becoming global, but I think the law is the only remedy, and which binds the different countries also. As you know, we have seen that some countries are in a binding to obey the laws internationally. I think that can be the only one remedy, and also the advanced technology to the intelligence agencies, to the crime investigation agencies, because the criminals have become financial criminals have become
sophisticated. They're so sophisticated. I mean, they are grandmasters at chess, because if you put a control in place, they see it as a challenge. They'll find a way to circumvent that control. Now, just think about it. If they have the ability and the skill to do that, wouldn't it be great to buy them in, to bring them on board, to say, look, I mean, we do that with in the police. When I was in the police service, if we had a computer issue, for example, we'd buy in ethical hackers, because, you know, their services was ideal for us. We couldn't afford them 24/7, but they used to come in as part of the investigation team, and we used to pay them a huge amount of money to look at problems that we had when it comes to the computer systems, and it was dead easy for them. It's dead easy for them. So, you know, if we can sort of you know, turn thief into an investigator, that would suit me down to the ground. So, so brilliant.
We're going to have to call time on you. Any questions? Please, anybody else? Roxanne.
They want to just make security is more trustable than government. They are more transparency at work. In the government, they have more bureaucracy.
Less bureaucracy, acceptance, really, and not only that, more success. They're more successful, and in a short time frame. And if a corporation is looking at success in a small time frame, it's cost effective.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. What is the influence from government and politicians? It also get by
Sorry.
for private investigators.
Yeah.
How do you manage the influence from the politician and also not being brought for certain cases to pursue?
That's an area that I'm looking at. It's all very well saying, why can't the private investigators work with the police and other departments that are legislated to investigate crime? But on top of that, you've got to look at the ethical limitations, who's responsible for what, and to a certain extent, there has to be boundaries of areas of responsibility and acceptance of those. So that there has to be a clear network of communication and clear understanding of what boundaries will go to. But I would say start off small and through trial and error, let it grow organically and to see where we go. Personally, I think it's worth a good, as I say, so thanks very much today. Brilliant.
Thanks, David. Thank you very much.